The red wave that's coming is going to be like the elevator doors opening up in The Shining. That's what I think. I think people are just like, what the fuck are you saying? They're making Republicans.
This was not only not a red wave, it was not a red tide, it was barely a red trickle. Barely a red trickle, which means heads should roll. When your football team is expected to go 16-0, it's one thing if your football team then proceeds to go 14-2 or 10-6. If your football team proceeds to go 8-8, people get fired. The entire coaching staff, the entire leadership team in the Republican Party needs to go, and it needs to go now. Now, I spoke to the Republican House Caucus back in 2021, and I said to them, if somehow you fail to take the House, given the conditions that you have been given, every one of you ought to lose your jobs. Well, they're barely going to take the House, and I mean barely going to take the House. The current estimate suggests that Republicans are going to win somewhere between 8 and 15 seats in the House. They started off with 212. That means they will end up on the low end at 220 out of 435, which means that they would have a 5-seat majority in the House after starting with just a 10-seat minority in the House. That is an extraordinarily crappy result. In the Senate, the Republicans look like they are going to be on the losing edge of this one. Basically, the entire Senate comes down right now to Georgia, where it looks like there will be a runoff between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. Arizona, not all the votes are in because apparently all the votes in Arizona are counted by a single blind nun working in Mozambique. And so we have to take at least 7 years to count all the votes in Arizona.
So progressive. People are just dug in. They're dug in really deep right now. And
John Fetterman, you're talking about?
Absolutely. He is so extreme, wants to open up a third of the prisons.
Doesn't frack?
Yeah, exactly, and lied about it. How about Mandela Barnes? I mean, he wants to open 50% of the prisons.
Right. He's trailing.
And he's running against Ron Johnson, but it's still tight. But how do you explain this country now, Brian, to your point? I mean, we have open borders, record gas prices, inflation is the worst in 40 years. The president's approval ratings are so bad, worst crime since the 1980s, and yet I heard last night this is an indictment on the Republican Party. Is it? I mean, how are these issues, when our country is in such a bad state right now, how is this not a red wave?
I got a question for you. Charlie may want to avoid the finger pointing right now, but I kind of don't, and I think that it's time for people to accept the reality of the civil war inside of the Republican Party. It does seem as though, talking about doing nothing, man, I've never seen anything more flaccid and linguini-spined than the way that the corporate GOP approached this very winnable election. Now, I think there's a lot of synthesis to be done, but you touched on McCarthy. I thought it was wild the way they rolled out this plan for America. I saw nothing about it. Nothing. I am obsessed with following the news. I got an entire team of young kids, 20 years old. All they do is look at clips online. Never once did I get a clip about Kevin McCarthy going based, going flamethrower, Kevin McCarthy rip-roaring. Never once. I didn't get a single clip that, like, the corporate GOP did a single fire thing in this election. And we cover this day in and day out. We have the best damn people on the internet covering the hottest clips out there, and we go nuts for it. And if Kevin McCarthy did something based, I would have covered it. I have nothing against it. But I didn't get a single clip.
See, there's some unhappiness, but I don't know about you guys. I'm shocked there was no red wave. If you think about inflation, a 40-year high, crime the worst since the 1980s, the unpopular president with an agenda that's more green-oriented than people-oriented.
We have the worst inflation in 4 decades, the worst collapse in real wages in 40 years, the worst crime wave since the 1990s, the worst border crisis in U.S. history. We have Joe Biden, who is the least popular president since Harry Truman, since presidential polling happened, and there wasn't a red wave. That is a searing indictment of the Republican Party. That is a searing indictment of the message that we have been sending to the voters. They looked at all of that and looked at the Republican alternative and said, no thanks. The Republican Party needs to do a really deep introspection look in the mirror right now, because this is an absolute disaster for the Republican Party, and we need to turn back. We need to look at who won today. Ron DeSantis, DeWine, these governors, Kemp, Abbott. You know, look at these governors. This is the path to the future. At electing these And, you know, these radical candidates who ran far behind them has put the Republican Party in a terrible position, and voters have have indicted the Republican Party.
After our marathon election coverage last night, I emerged from the studio and looked up to see the promised red moon, or I was hoping to see it, but I couldn't see anything because it was overcast. It was, I think, a perfect symbol, the red moon blotted out by clouds and fog, just as the red wave lost steam and became, in the end, at most a red ripple, a small red splash maybe in the shallow end of the pool.